Hello, and welcome to the podcast. Last week at the RTS Cambridge Convention, the UK's public service broadcasters, including the BBC, ITV, Channel 4 and Channel 5, set out a series of measures to secure distinct British broadcasting in the years ahead. It was a statement of intent about the future of PSB in a media landscape increasingly dominated by global platforms. But it also raised questions about what public service broadcasting really means, how it should adapt, and where its limits are. That's why this week we're speaking to Mark Damazer. Few people are better placed to assess these developments. He's a former controller of Radio 4 and deputy director of BBC News, and a BBC trustee, and now a writer and commentator and chair of the Booker Prizes. He's been consistently engaged with the debate about public service media's role at home and abroad. His recent article in Prospect, BBC Sounds Turns Inwards, looks at how the BBC is reshaping its international audio offer. Mark Damazer, thank you for joining the podcast.
It's a delight. Pleasure.
Oh, I'm sure.
No, it is, Roger. It's a pleasure to meet you again.
Oh, thank you. Well, I promised not to talk about Tottenham Hotspur, so I'm not going to embarrass you by the fact that they are third in the Premier League and won't be for very long. Let's move on, though, to an article you've written in Prospect magazine about the BBC, how the BBC essentially is reshaping its, what it would call its international audio offer. And it was headlined, BBC Sounds Turn Inward, and you're not happy about it. Why not?
Well, I mean, the BBC has limped in stages throughout the course of this year into a position which is probably now sustainable for its overseas audiences who love BBC audio and love BBC radio programmes and podcasts. But it's pretty obvious, looking at the sequence of events, when the BBC launched its plan, which was to get rid of BBC Sounds, which is what we all use in the UK, or many of us do, when we want to listen to BBC radio stations, and particularly when we want to listen to radio programmes that we've not caught live. BBC decided to get rid of that for its audiences outside the UK and try something else, which was to get those audiences to listen via bbc.com, which is the BBC website for overseas audiences, which has long since had adverts in it, and to launch a new BBC app, which would be available only abroad and under one big app would join up BBC News and BBC Audio and BBC Text and so on and so forth. So the BBC wanted to launch that in the spring. Then they worked out they hadn't got all the answers, then they delayed it. Now it's come on stream. It's still full of problems and issues, and there's a lack of clarity about what it is, but they're solving the problems one by one. And so you're now able to get most, though not all, of the BBC's radio stations live through these various vehicles, and you are able to get its podcasts and all of that. There's still quite a lot that's been lost, and you feel really quite strongly they've been making it up as they go along, and they've had a lot of trouble communicating to these audiences outside the UK interested in BBC audio what it is that they're actually doing.
Well, I've had quite a lot of difficulty communicating to anybody like you and me who are interested in what they're trying to do. And this is driven, isn't it, in part by the fact that the BBC has to save money and it does not want to have to pay, if you like, music rights on things that would broadcast abroad. In the past, it wouldn't have mattered. People wouldn't have thought there was revenue. Now, other organisations think there's revenue to be had, want it from the BBC, and the BBC says, don't think we can afford that.
There's a push and a pull here. I mean, one factor is, as you say, music rights, which has always been a quarrel between the music industry and the BBC about who should be paying whom for what, never ending, and how that plays out when BBC music programmes are overseas and what should the intellectual property rights holders of those music programmes or music stations get when the BBC is broadcasting these programmes outside the UK. It's been going on for a long time. I had thought, not least by listening to some of your previous podcasts, Roger, and indeed the BBC's own feedback programme, that the music rights issue was driving it. But when I spoke to the press office before I wrote that Prospect article and said, is this being done because of the music rights problem, or is it being done because you think you can monetize audio outside the UK? They gave me the steer that it was the latter, that it was to do with the prospect of making money out of BBC audio. And about that, I raise an eyebrow.
Why? Do you think it's just mission impossible, or do you have a principled objection to it?
I think it's remarkably difficult. I mean, I looked at it when I was at the BBC myself. Is it possible that the glories of BBC radio down the ages, and by the way, just an unmatched archive, I don't think there's a broadcaster in the world who is anywhere near what the BBC has done and could offer from its enormously rich radio archive. It's quite astonishing if you could ever search it. The notion that you could make money out of speech radio, and I suspect even music radio outside the UK, BBC branded, I'm very, very sceptical about. I may be wrong. Obviously, the BBC will claim that all its business plans are commercially sensitive and they won't give us what the projections are. But I would be amazed whether all the song and dance that the BBC has gone through over the last year, and as I say, song and dance hit and miss, is whether or not it will produce enough revenue to have been worth all the bother and fuss that's led to where the BBC is now.
But in terms of soft power, I mean, at the time and time again when I did feedback, I would hear from Australia or elsewhere, people saying how much they appreciate these programs. You read subsequently people who we never thought would have listened to BBC programming from abroad have done, and it's had a significant impact on them, but also in their view of this country. I mean, simply in terms of soft power, does it make any sense at all to try and make out what you and I both think would be a minuscule amount of money, if it's there, at the price of cutting off effectively a potential audience there who might learn more about this country and more about a whole range of other things?
Well, let's run the BBC's defence. And the BBC's defence, which is legitimate, is that the vast majority of listening to radio come audio is done live. And that all of that, barring 5 Live, as far as I can see, will be available. This was not the original plan. It was only going to be BBC Radio 4 Live and the World Service Live, and then there was a tremendous kickback, and now all these stations, most of these other stations at least, will be available live listening. That is where the majority of the audience gets its audio and fine. So the question is, what about the rest of it? So there's a bit of podcasting that goes on. And then there's this phrase that the rather able guy who runs BBC Sounds, Jonathan Wall, keeps on coming up with, which is loss of functionality or change in functionality, which I think is a synonym for there's some stuff here that used to be available that isn't available anymore. So the service has been thinned out, and to that extent it chimes in with your question, which is it's a loss of something, and therefore, so to speak, logically, a loss of the BBC's influence and soft power on the programmes that used to be available, not live, time-shifted, that are no longer available. Now, in the grander scheme of things, I can't say that's the biggest issue the BBC faces or anything like it, but I think it's a bit of a shame. And it poses this question in my mind's eye, which is, had the BBC ever been in a position where it could have made a really, really serious effort to advertise outside the UK? I don't use advertise in the literal sense, publicise outside the UK, that it's got this unbelievable set of programmes which it's broadcast over the last God knows how many decades, where it has the intellectual property rights, and these are speech programmes. It's a fantastic resource around the world. But that would require a lot of effort and thinking about how to market that to the audiences that might be interested in it. One thinks of teachers and universities and just people with great intellectual curiosity and an interest in the English language and so on. Because the BBC's offer is so much greater potentially than anybody else's, because it's been making these programmes, I mean, not least and above all through Radio 4, but to some extent the World Service and Radio 3, for decades and decades and decades.
And what you're effectively saying, it's got a massive asset, and you shouldn't think of it in terms of money. You should think it in terms of contribution, if you like, to the world. But I mean, this is, you never hear this sort of language. You don't hear it at Cambridge. I want to raise the Cambridge Convention with you in a moment. I certainly don't hear it from the Secretary of State. I'm not sure, frankly, hear it from anybody at the BBC, which is about the potential of the medium, not just the necessity, if you like, for supporting the BBC. That sort of vision that you've just put forward about the archive of not least Radio 4 and its potential for the world, not just this country, is not articulated by any BBC leader at the moment that I know of.
Well, I've got some sympathy with the BBC. I mean, I've articulated something rather grand. It's a sort of thought bubble, which is that the BBC's radio magnificence going back for decades is a resource for the world. It's quite easy for me to spin that into a nice-sounding sentence, and I would very much hope that one day somebody will work out how to do it. But it would require a huge amount of not merely thinking and resource, but, I mean, BBC time and finance. And
yeah, but if a Secretary of State in the run-up to Charter renewal said, we really think the BBC could concentrate, one of the things it should concentrate is this area because we think it's something that Britain can offer the world, you can bet your bottom dollar the BBC would respond.
Well, it would be nice to think that the idea that the BBC sits on the world's greatest audio archive in the English language, and quite possibly, for all I know, in any language, is both true and is in some way realisable into a project for the rest of the world. I would very much like it to happen. I do think that it is fraught with difficulty and complexity. Now, that is not what's been driving these recent changes in BBC Sounds and the loss of BBC Sounds overseas. I think it's sort of something else, and that they have, I don't even know how advertent it is, just junked a whole load of programmes which I think are of tremendous worth for the audience outside the UK, and now they may be restoring these programmes bit by bit, but the whole thing has been so clunkily executed, I'm sorry to say, that it's very difficult to know if and when these programmes will come back, but they certainly weren't in the centre of the BBC's mind when they were making the changes they've made.
And when you look at the Secretary of State, Lisa Nandy, we look to her to have a vision of public service broadcasting for the future, to initiate a charter debate which is wide-ranging and what isn't simply about the means of paying for the BBC. Do you have any sign that the Secretary of State is capable or willing to do that?
Well, Lisa Nandy, I had some hopes when she came in. I mean, I think she's clearly an extremely articulate and able person, but she seems to have spent most of the first year of her tenure as Secretary of State wanting to run the BBC's internal disciplinary processes. And she gave full vent to her opinions about the BBC's mistakes around Gaza programmes. It's not the programme Now with You, it's not the podcast Now with You to discuss those in any detail, but okay, all right, things didn't go perfectly, but quite why Lisa Nandy inserted herself into this conversation with quite the vigour that she did, thus, as it were.
Now, let's be straight, she effectively called for Tim Davie to go. Not quite.
Yeah, pretty close to it.
Pretty close to it, and the industry fortunately said, oh, push off.
Yes, exactly, and as the BBC's chair, and quite right too, that is to say that it was none of her business. But she seems to have said something at Cambridge which is quite striking, and I'm entirely pleased that she did it, which is a full-throated defence of public service broadcasting and the BBC's role within it. And although various secretaries of state have, down the ages, trotted along to conventions like Cambridge to say how important the BBC was and is, and will continue to be, they've very often done it with a hand in front of their mouth for fear of offending either the Prime Minister of the day by being too full-throated in their defence, or by upsetting people who feel that the licence fee is an expensive burden. So they've always managed the defence of the BBC half-heartedly.
Not to say those commercial figures who see the BBC as an obstruction to making further profits. Certainly it was the case with the Murdoch Empire, and it's certainly the case now with GB News, funded by Sir Paul Marshall, who is a hedge fund manager, who owns The Spectator, and who's made it very clear in speech after speech he has no time for the BBC, and it's an obstruction in his view to free speech. I mean, one shouldn't ignore all of these commercial animals who will really have an interest in pulling, if not eliminating the BBC or reducing its size and influence. That's a reality.
They've been there forever. And if you want the biggest structural difference between the UK public service broadcasting market and the US public service broadcasting market, it's this. The BBC came first. Public service broadcasting came first in the UK, which meant that everybody else who's piled in afterwards, including GB News and Paul Marshall, will have always piled in knowing that the BBC is there, that it has a big market intervention, currently the best part of £4 billion, which they may resent. But when they're making their calculations about profit and loss and shareholder value and all the rest of it, they know jolly well that the BBC is an enormous player in the British media market, and then they take their chances. And surprisingly enough, down the decades, a lot of them have made money, even with the BBC there. But it's up to them to make their own business plans and make it add up. In America, of course, it's the other way around. That is to say, public service broadcasting arrived very, very late in the day after the commercial broadcasters were established. And it's been much more difficult in America for public service broadcasting to get a purchase than it has been in the UK. So for everybody who complains commercial broadcasters in the UK, they've always known that the BBC was there. Now it's up to you to make money knowing that the BBC is there, and they have made money.
And when you look at the States, however, at the moment, you see a concerted attack on the concept of public service broadcasting from the Trump administration in a whole variety of ways, which are deeply worrying, from Voice of America, I suppose, at one end to the local stations and so on. But then also the BBC thinks they've spotted an opportunity there, a business opportunity there. They're very significantly investing in the United States because they believe it will be possible to pitch, if you like, a new service which will occupy territory perhaps which has never been occupied, or at least is now being vacated in the States. Now, that's a gamble, but I wonder, I'm interested in both whether you think the gamble is worthwhile and might be successful. But I'm also interested in your concept, the fact that if you invest that amount of money and resource, you start to overdose, if you're not careful, on domestic programming, on American material. Let's take, first of all, the question of whether there is a real business opportunity for the BBC with a news operation in the United States, broadcasting essentially to the United States.
Yes, I mean, the BBC does have a foothold in the United States. I mean, it's not very surprisingly more likely to be successful, the BBC on the coasts, than it is in the heartland of America. But the BBC has a following, and it has had a presence and a news presence in America now for decades. I mean, will it grow because of the way the American media market is responding to Trump, i.e., in itself becoming more inhibited and cowed, or in some cases losing its editorial moorings by overreacting to Trump and therefore finding impartial broadcasting harder and harder because they just turn themselves into opposition to Trump voices? Does that leave the BBC an opportunity with its own version of impartiality? I think it probably does.
Doesn't it also mean that if it operates in that way, it will become a target for Trump? I was interested in an article by Ian Burrell in the Independent yesterday. Trump's assault on the media could mean tough times for the BBC. I mean, it's quite clear that, as Trump said himself, he hates his enemies, and enemy is the one who doesn't agree with him. So we could see a situation in which Trump continues or extends his assault on certain media outlets in the United States to the BBC. It's not unreal, is it? An unreal thought?
Well, he doesn't have any control over the funding of the BBC, unlike those organisations in the States that he's gone after, where there are big corporate battles, where the federal government needs to be on side and not put obstructions in the way of these corporate deals. There's no such situation that exists with the BBC for Trump to kind of get his teeth into. So, I mean, he'll deal with the chat show hosts one by one, and then he'll find something else that upsets him and he'll go there. But I think he'll find the BBC quite a hard nut to crack because he doesn't have the levers of control. I mean, he may be very upset with the BBC and he may abuse the BBC, and all that will do, I think, will be largely to increase the BBC standing both in the United States and outside. So
how about the second part? The second part, though, that, you know all this about Westminster politics and the danger that the BBC's investment in Westminster, laudable in many ways, led in the past at least to perhaps politics being seen too much through Westminster. Now you have this investment in the United States. And I'm struck by the fact that the BBC, no fault of its own, I think it's got one correspondent in China. And it's got this massive staffing in the States. So you're sitting there thinking around the 10 o'clock news, it's a dull day. You can always rely on BBC Westminster to deliver you a political story and BBC America to deliver you an American story.
I have to say, when I was at Radio 4, I got into a lot of trouble when you were doing feedback, Roger, with audiences that thought that I was obsessed with America. So I'm not the best person to say that the BBC is obsessed with America. I mean, I think there are very many good things about the BBC's coverage of America. I mean, I think Americast is a really extremely good podcast. And I'm afraid, whether we like it or not, it remains hugely the number one power in the world and certainly in the Western world, and it's very, very hard to avoid it. And I don't think, I'd be really, really surprised if people were commissioning programmes about America in the UK for UK audiences.
No, but they've been manipulated.
In the hope that it will sell well in the US. I just don't think that's the way it works.
But it's been manipulated, isn't it? I mean, we've got an absolute master. I mean, we've never had a situation where we've had someone like Trump who will, there'll be an official communique at the end of a meeting, and then the plane will fly up and then fly off, and then he'll walk back and tell on the record all the time, correspondence, what he thinks, go into his cabinet and then put something on social media. So that news, it's almost impossible to stop him manipulating you. And you can see to a degree Nigel Farage starting to copy that. By the time you've caught up with the statement the next day, there's another statement. So it's not just the domination by America in one way, it's the inability to have an alternative agenda or to do a sustained examination of what's being proposed, because there's always another story coming down the line.
Well, that is true. And that is called flooding the zone, and a phrase I think invented and certainly popularised by Steve Bannon, who is the outrider for the Trump project and a man who I think would be thought of in the Britain as decidedly right-wing. All of that is true, and I think we're all struggling with it, which is that his ability to find a microphone or a camera anywhere and opine with great, how can I put it, vigour, Trump. Remarkable, I think, for his age. He still keeps finding ways of communicating with brio. Not the message that I might like, but he does it with brio, means that he commands a vast amount of news attention, and you just can't keep up with analysing one issue before another comes down the road. And it's both a distraction and also to some extent a necessity. You can't really avoid what the President of the United States is saying about an item on the news agenda, or even when he creates one his own, knowing perfectly confidently that you're right to dismiss this particular soundbite as worthless because it may not be.
Well, you can at least put it down the running order, can't you? I mean, look at Lib Dem conference, which happened this weekend. They always struggle for attention, despite the number of MPs, whatever. And it's quite interesting they have to struggle more because the last few days, because Trump on one hand and Nigel Farage on the other. And you think, you don't always have to lead with Trump. I mean, were you Deputy Director of News again? Would you be wandering into your newsroom and saying, just because Trump has said something which is pithy and newsworthy, you don't have to always run it at the top of the programme?
Well, the way the BBC works would be as follows. If I were to go in and say that, I'm sure that the instant reaction of all the editors would be to try and find a way of doing the opposite. What does he know? Look, there are things that you can do. You obviously kind of put in various different voices to add context and to do the necessary fact-checking on what Trump has said or invented on any particular day. Sure, you can make an effort every now and then to try and say, look, if it's not really obviously central or new, let's put it down the running order, not run it altogether. I mean, all of these sort of minor techniques of intervention to try and stop yourself being drip-fed America the whole time are worth a go. But in the end, there is some overwhelming truth here, which is that Trump is newsworthy because of the position that he holds and because his ability to conjure up phrases and sentences which burst through and shock, outrage, reflect, react, or create something of news value are what they are. And you can be self-abnegating to a certain extent, and you can try and be more disciplined, but if you completely go your own way and say, the President of the United States has just said that a late-night chat show host should be fired immediately, and then say, no, that's not really news. In the context of Charlie Kirk's death, you're making the wrong judgment because it is news.
Well, okay. But I mean, when I think of you as Radio 4 controller, what you brought to the network was a sense of history, a sense of context, and so on. And what a lot of us are thinking at the moment, I think, particularly about the Middle East coverage and elsewhere, is not that it's right, wrong, biased, or whatever, all that sort of stuff. But what is missing is context. What is missing is history. What has been squeezed out, and I know there are budgetary reasons, are the sort of prose that Ed Sturton would have done and did do, and you commissioned as well, which provide an opportunity to understand the present in terms of the past. I mean, I may have missed it, a proper in-depth program about Hamas, which gives equal weight also to the religious background behind it. I haven't seen a history of the Middle East, recently which would do that. I haven't seen a history of Zionism and so on. I haven't seen a program which looks at the difference between anti-Semitism and this particular Israeli government. I've seen a range of things where, is this a result of a squeeze or whatever? The sort of, okay, news is going to be news and you have to respond, where the contextual ability of the BBC seems to be diminished. Do you think it is?
Well, that was a brilliant pitch for the commissioning job, if not the controller job of Radio 4. I mean, honestly, perfect, Roger. I mean, that was absolutely excellent. I've heard elements of all of those things within Radio 4 sequence programmes, by which I mean, Today, The World at 1, BH, PM, and so on. You could make a very decent case for each of those programmes in their own right. I think out of Radio 4, I get more of a sense for history and context than I do anywhere else in the broadcast media in the UK that I know of. It's still not analogous to a newspaper. You're still dealing with compressed space. The medium is what the medium is, and it can't give you the equivalent of the Financial Times coverage or a longer piece that you might get in Prospect or wherever. But I don't think that it's a historically illiterate network, and there could always be more for subjects that you think you might be interested in. I mean, I feel that you've made a very good case there for several programmes that I would listen to if they were well done.
Yes, about 40 years too late in my test. Finally, I want to come to last week's RTS convention. And together, the UK public service broadcasters, obviously Channel 5, Channel 4, BBC, they called for 5 bold interventions, they said. First of all, prominence across devices and platforms. That's straight to the government so that, people can find them or run into them to make sure they don't disappear. The promotion of accurate, impartial news across platforms and social media to directly challenge the threat of fake news. Everybody would agree. Tax credits for homegrown storytelling to boost shared experiences and societal cohesion. And this means sustainable public funding for the BBC. Fourth is a commitment to an IP switchover that recognises the value of a fully connected population, staying sensitive to issues of digital exclusion, which I can't quite understand, but I think it means there are some digitally deprived people. You can't switch over and leave 5 million people switched off. So please get on with it, government. And then finally, the removal of unnecessary barriers so PSBs can form strategic partnerships with other broadcasters and compete globally. Now, all of that sounds pretty good, but what it doesn't seem to me, and I don't know if you're going to agree with me on this, is a vision. I mean, you used to be at a trustee of the Victoria and Albert Museum. You know about the potential riches that are there. What I look for in the BBC is somebody to say, look, if we've got enough money, if you'll give it, we can do this for the arts. By the way, the BBC doesn't have a director of arts, does it? We can do this for science. We've got this fantastic tool. This in our children. We know what the problems with our children of science, or for example, now the fact that fewer and fewer are learning modern languages. This is the potential of public service broadcasting. Now, we can't do it all, but we want to have this conversation about what we can do and then have the conversation about how we deliver it and how we pay for it. But what I don't hear is the vision. I'm just here, let's continue doing what we're doing, but with rather fewer resources.
I'm more benign about that than you are, Roger. I think that there are certain very obvious central tenets or truths about public service broadcasting, and they don't vary. Of course, the method of delivering these grand truths about public service broadcasting do change, but what is it? It's British programmes, British content making, centering on British talent for British audiences across the range. It's bringing the nation together for great events, royal events or Olympic Games or World Cups and so on and so forth. And it's about making this available to all people. Not every programme will appeal to all people, but providing something of value for all people enough of the time that they feel it's worth paying the licence fee. And connecting communities and providing impartial news to make the democracy healthier and more sustainable than it would be that if you didn't have public service broadcasting news values, which are not only the BBC's news values, they're shared by ITV and others, and Channel 4 and so on. Now, there are various different ways that you can say that. I could have injected that last 30 seconds with a great deal more passion and purple than I did. I did it in a rather bland and vanilla way. But they are the central things that have defined what public service broadcasting in the BBC has been about for generations. And various director generals do say this. Tim is as good at saying this as anybody else, and it's fine. And doubtless he will increase both the intensity, the passion, and the velocity with which he says this as we come close to Charter Renewal 2027. And I wish that I could say something that would be so startling and original and new that the nation would be enthused by the prospect and the need to sustain public service broadcasting, about which I'm a passionate believer. But I think you're being harsh if you think...
All right, but I'm being harsh, but listen. OK, but how about this, right? Well, if BBC got into trouble two years ago over its music policy, and it killed the BBC singers off and then revived them very quickly. And that was a classic case, the BBC deciding it knew best and then telling the music industry what it was going to do. There is another way. Another way is to say, we have to make some very difficult decisions over the next 6 months. We want to talk with you in the classical world, in the arts world, in the science world and elsewhere about what you think public service should be doing in your area. We can't do it all. And then as a result of that, we will put forward. But we're also looking for partnerships because we both share this ambition to present the finest that there is to the British audience primarily and then to the world. In other words, the BBC has to say, let us talk to the experts, as it were, first before it devises its policy. And in going forward to Charter Renewal, shouldn't it be saying to those communities in the educational world, in the arts world and elsewhere, let's talk together about what is potentially possible. And then we'll tell you what we think can be done.
Well, we try to launch a consulting process of the kind that you describe before the licence fee settlement that was due in around about 2015, but we got scotched because George Osborne simply mounted an ambush for the second time.
The then Chancellor of the Exchequer, yeah.
Yeah, and so the idea of a huge consultative process with the UK population in all its confusing demands and desires just didn't go anywhere. Look, the BBC has a very significant audience research department. It's got loads and loads of different metrics. Some of them are published, some of them, of course, are not. The public, as we all know, doesn't speak with one voice. If you ask anybody what their BBC is, you'll get about 45 million different versions of the BBC. That's both its joy and, to some extent, I dare say, it's frustrating because you have to work out the confusing signals. Yes, I mean, talking to the individual experts or the individually most committed groups about what it is they want out of the BBC is a completely worthwhile activity, but it won't give you a magic answer. You've still got to use your judgment across all the information that's being given to you to work out what the BBC should prioritise, what it will need to drop, what it might even spend more on. All of that is part of what the Director General and the team of people around Tim Davie are trying to do. They're going to cheese off a lot of people because, A, the BBC is a significantly smaller organisation than it was, financially speaking, 15, 20 years ago, and there's not enough to go around. And B, people disagree about what a good programme is and what a distinctive programme is and how to configure all of that.
Yeah, but what I'm worried about is that the BBC decides to survive in the future as an international business, it does a deal with government without a widespread public debate about what we want.
I think, I'm not on the inside, that the BBC will be launching a considerable amount of consultative processes to try and get as much insight as it can derive before it makes its final pitch and begins its negotiations, or the final set of its negotiations, about how the BBC is going to be funded and what it's going to do with the money. And I think it should do that. I suspect it is doing a fair amount of that, and there's probably more that will come down the road. I wouldn't overestimate, because I think hidden in your question, not quite, is the notion that, well, it will lead to some really greater clarity about the BBC's objectives and how it's going to deliver them. And I'm not sure how much of that will come. I mean, some perhaps, and it's the right thing to do in any event, because even making clear the extent to which the British public, the licence payers, want different things and are conflicting in their views and demands is in itself a useful reminder of the complexity of the enterprise, the pluralism of the UK, the rumbustious nature of our democracy, and not everybody's going to get everything. And even having that out on the table, because you've done a proper consultative process, is a good thing in and of itself. I mean, I think you're going to end up still, even now, with the central truths about the BBC being rammed home through a consultative process, which is that impartial news internationally, nationally, and not least locally, remains absolutely central to the BBC's mission. And if they're not doing it well enough for a large number of audiences, that is a big problem. I think there will be an insistence that the BBC continues to make high-class programmes which have nothing to do with news and current affairs, which are shaped around British concerns and British talent. And I think that's right too. And I'd be amazed if there still wasn't a desire for the BBC and or other public service broadcasters to be covering, free at the point of delivery, so to speak, big occasions such as Olympic Games and World Cups and as and when huge royal events and commemorative natural and national history events and so on and so forth. I mean, I don't think that any of those are going to be usurped by a consultative process. I think they're likely to be reinforced. Now, how that translates into both a funding mechanism, is it to be a licence fee or is it to be some household tax, and what that figure should be and how it should be linked to inflation, we have to wait and see. But my pitch on public service broadcasting has always been, in the final analysis, political and serious. That it is up to the people making the decisions on all of this to decide whether or not public service broadcasting, as something that is absolutely central to the health of a democracy, is worth having or not. If it's worth having, you're going to have to pay for it. If you're going to have to pay for it, a lot of people are going to be unhappy about it, but it might still be worth their while paying for it. That is an act of political will, of grown-up politicians in a room finally having to make a decision, shorn of the need to please editorial writers of those particular newspapers who feel that the licence fee is a terrific burden. Yeah, well, maybe. On the other hand, what would the UK be like without public service broadcasting? That's not just the BBC, without public service broadcasting. And I've thought throughout my life, and I feel no different now, for all the changes in network consumption and fragmentation and technology, that public service broadcasting is one of those things that makes British life and British democracy healthier.
Mark Damazer, thank you very much. Our thanks to former BBC trustee and controller of Radio 4, Mark Damazer. And if you want to find out what he's like as a reporter, well, you can listen on Sounds to his recent programme on the US Supreme Court. That was for Archive on 4. Now, if you'd like to support us, you can do so for less than the price of a cup of coffee. Just head for patreon.com/BeebWatch and sign up for £1.99 a month. You'll also receive my weekly blog where I share some reflections on the week's interview. You don't have to read it. And that's all for this week. This podcast is presented by me, Roger Bolton, and it's produced by Kate Dixon, with sound by Dave Kitto, and special thanks to Quinn Genty. It's a Good Egg production. Until next time, goodbye.